Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In Book 1 of On the Nature of the Gods, after Cicero has Velleius the Epicurean present the Epicurean point of view, including an argument for the existence of the gods from common consent, which is a little bit complicated, involves some special technical matters, the preconceptions that Epicurus himself appeals to. What we have is a skeptical takedown of that argument on the part of Cotta. And it's actually an interesting way in which it's handled, because there are some points that Cotta could have made to go further in his attack, but he says he's going to deal generously, or as we might say, rather charitably, with the argument. And he's not going to say, well, this is a terrible argument, it's complete garbage. He's going to say, well, there's some flaws with this. And, what we can see here are some failures, not just for Epicureans making this particular argument, but anybody who wants to make a similar appeal in what we could call the philosophy of religion. So Cotta begins, after some preambles, by saying, in an inquiry as to the nature of the gods, the first question that we need to ask is very straightforward. Do the gods exist or not? Sintne di necne sint. And he says that, his opponents would say, oh, it's difficult to deny that the gods exist. And this is the first really interesting point. He's going to say, well, if we were in a public forum, yeah, it might be difficult. And why, we should pause on that. Why would it be difficult to deny that the gods exist? Because everybody else seems to be committed to that idea. It's part not just of people's private religion. Not a lot of that exists back then, but more of a public cultural point of view that's largely agreed upon. So, sure, if we're in public, but we're not in public, we're actually having a private conversation at my own house. And so Cotta is going to go on and say, in a company like the present, it's perfectly easy, facilimum, very easy to deny the existence of the gods. We have more freedom when we're thinking on our own and talking with each other than we would if we were, say, someplace more conspicuous. So Cotta is going to say, listen, I want to be convinced that the gods exist, persuaded, persuadere, but not just by, as it is translated here, an article of faith, which is actually opinione solum, not just by a viewpoint, but by, translated here as an ascertained fact, or more literally, that it's the truth, veritas. Right? I want to be convinced by the truth itself. So how is this going to take place? Well, there is an argument that Velleius has given, and part of that argument, as I just mentioned earlier, is actually being left out. There's this idea that Epicurus had that we could call them preconceptions, general conceptions, inborn ideas, whatever you want to call them, but we all share them. All humankind have these in common. And since we all have preconceptions of the gods, both as individuals and if we look at general cultures, the gods must exist. So the argument is going to be generated like this. And when Cotta goes to this, he says, listen, I myself believe the gods exist. I'm actually a priest. I do religious activities, but I'm not convinced by your argument. And here we should, again, pause for a minute and think about the implications of this. Quite a few people, when it comes to back and forth dialogue or debates about the existence of gods or God or the divine, they will look at an argument, and the argument is supposed to prove that whatever it is that you're conceiving it of, the gods, God, something else, exists. And inevitably, the argument won't be convincing to everybody. There isn't any argument for the existence of the divine that does work for every single rational being. And so they'll say, aha, so because this argument doesn't work, the opposite side is proved, God doesn't exist or the gods don't exist. That is not what Cotta is doing at all. Cotta is actually saying, your argument doesn't seem so good to me, right? I'm not satisfied with the soundness of your reasoning that you're given here. He says, it's translated here, I doubt the adequacy of the argument which you're adducing to prove this. So let's look at the argument. What is the argument as Cotta reconstructs it? So he says, all nations and races of humanity, everybody, if we look at every single culture, think that it is the case, or it appears to them, ita viderente. It appears to them that it is the case that there are gods, right? So this then provides sufficient reason to acknowledge, to have trust, we could say, confiteremur, that we can have trust, that gods actually exist, esse deos. And he says, id satis magnum argumentum dixisti. You have said that this is enough, satis, sufficient, you could say. Magnum argumentum, this is a great argument, this is a very strong argument for the gods existing. So, because everybody everywhere, as communities, as groups, believes in some sort of God, there must be gods. Okay, why is this a bad argument? Why is it, as he says, inconclusive, leve per se, kind of weak, right? Light, or just false, falsum? What's wrong with this argument? And he's going to give three different lines of reasoning, three different modes of attack. One of these is actually a little bit off base because it's already been acknowledged by the Epicurean as he presented things. So the first one's actually quite good. How do you know what the views of foreign people are? I mean, if you think about the Roman world at the time, they could say, well, we know about people who border us, and maybe we even know about other people by travelers' reports, so we can know something about, say, people in India, or we could know something about people beyond the German barbarians way up north or out east or something like that. Or maybe we've got legendary stories about what happens in sub-Saharan Africa or past Ethiopia. But does that mean that you know what every single tribe, nation, group, community actually thinks? No. I mean, can we, even at this point in time, say that we effectively understand the religious beliefs of every single community of human beings in the world? Maybe, maybe not. Even less so at the time that they're writing. And now, Cotta is going to go a little bit further perhaps than he should. He says, I think, for my part, there are many nations so uncivilized and barbarous as to have no notion, and it's interesting, suspicio, no suspicion of gods at all, nullum, right? And maybe this is just an idea on his part. He doesn't have any proof for that either, but it's enough to say it could be the case that there are people out there that we just haven't encountered who don't have any notion of the gods. They don't disbelieve in the gods because it's not even an issue for them. So, that's actually a pretty good line of attack until we have evidence that every single human being across the board does in fact belong to a community that believes in some sort of god or gods. Maybe we can't make that argument. We don't actually have the common consent. The second one is a little bit weaker. Philosophers have either denied or said that they were uncertain, they were in doubt about the existence of gods. And he gives some examples here. Theodorus, denied the divine existence. So did Diagoras, called the atheist. Okay, can't have any better evidence for not believing in gods than being called the atheist. Protagoras, the greatest sophist of that age, began a book with the words about the gods. I'm unable to affirm either how they exist or how they do not exist. So, and they suffered as a result, as he points out, but that's kind of besides the point. So, if important philosophers have had their doubts about not just the nature of the gods, but the existence of the gods, why should we conclude that there is a common consent? And, Velleius has already acknowledged this. So it seems like that's not a very good attack. You could say, well, there's crazy stuff that philosophers believed in. We're not talking about philosophers, we're talking about communities. But then we get another line of criticism, and this one's actually quite good, and it's hard to respond to without having to go into all sorts of, mental gymnastics, let's say. So some people commit sacrilege or impiety or perjury. And when they commit perjury, they have sworn an oath to the gods. So if they really believed in the existence of gods, would they be committing sacrilege, like stealing from temples or anything like that, or engaging in impious behavior of other sorts, or swearing oaths to gods that they know that they're not going to honor? Well, no. So by their own actions, they show us that they don't actually believe in the gods. And, we could actually say, you see this in just about every community that we know about. There are going to be some gods, and then there's going to be some people who don't take them seriously. So atheism, in a practical sense, isn't just for one-off weirdo philosophers. It's also for criminals of all sorts. And I suppose you could say, well, there's something wrong with them if they were good members of the community. But that's not the response here, because the argument from common consent is saying everybody's got some notion of the gods. And this is saying, well, no, these people don't believe that the gods exist. So this is a set of criticisms of the argument from common consent, which many people think is one of the weakest of the arguments or proofs for God or the God's existence. There's other possibilities that could be brought forward to attack that. We're not getting a lot of discussion of that by Cotta, this skeptic who says he wants to believe, but he needs some better argument or evidence for it. He's going to deal generously, but he could have actually looked at the notion of preconceptions as well, which he's going to talk about later on in saying, let's say the gods actually do exist. You Epicureans say we all have the same ideas about what their life is like, what their form is like. He's going to move on to that. But
this first issue of whether or not the gods exist is not satisfactorily addressed with the argument from common consent, which is the only argument that Velleius the Epicurean brought forward.